Welcome back, guys. So I just wanted to run through some definitions with you and talk about fiscal policy as a whole. This is going to be pretty short, and then it's going to break into two other videos. One is HL only for Keynesian multiplier, which is some math. SLs, you can look at it just to know what the graph looks like, but you don't actually have to do the math, remember. Following that, there is one more video that you'll watch, but we'll get to that. So fiscal policy is technically manipulations by the government of its own expenditures and taxes to influence the level of aggregate demand. Remember, we're looking at GDP growth. Fiscal policy can only influence government spending, consumption spending, and levels of investment spending. So it doesn't touch that last little bit about trade, right? Fiscal policy can be expansionary. So if we are in a recessionary gap, and it can also be contractionary to fix an inflationary gap. So if we're growing too fast, they might look to cut spending in certain parts. And yes, there are problems that are associated with growing too quickly. Additionally, if we are in a recession, we know what the federal government seems to do. We're sitting in a situation right now where we had kind of this unforeseen coronavirus issue where suddenly the government needs to come in and they're spending $2 trillion to try to jumpstart the recessionary gap caused by the coronavirus. So if we're going to do an expansionary fiscal policy, government policy taken to expand aggregate demand during a recessionary gap, what ways can the federal government do that? Well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? You just write up a bill and you put a whole lot of money in the hands of a whole lot of people. That could be in the form of, say, infrastructure. Under the recession, the Great Recession in 2009, Obama put a ton of money into the policy to try to fix roads and a bunch of different infrastructure projects, bridges and things, get people physically working. You can also see, in this case, an extraordinary circumstance of literally putting money in our hands, $1,200 checks going out to anybody who makes less than $100,000 a year, or $75,000, I think is what it is. So you have multiple things that can be done in a fiscal policy sense that the federal government can do. How does it impact? How do expansionary policies impact classical model of LRAS versus Keynesian model of LRAS, so long-run aggregate supply? Remember what those graphs look like, and I'll show you in a minute. But think about that for a moment. You should have a pretty decent idea. Finally, if you want to look at contractionary fiscal policy, that is government policy taken to contract aggregate demand during an inflationary period. So in other words, we have high inflation. So how do we get that high inflation down? What do you think that they would do is the question. So basically, they would want to take money out of circulation in some way, shape, or form. So in other words, the government, as far as its spending, there would be less. That probably would look something like a tax cut, for example, although that actually can be of a detriment because when people get more money back, they tend to spend it. So more likely they will probably look to cut the amount of money that they put into things that expand GDP, and they will look to invest in basically research and development. Okay, how would contractionary policies affect LRAS, or the long-run aggregate supply and Keynes? So this is called the ratcheting effect. You're going to have to kind of take a look at that. So remember these two, okay? What happens with contractionary policy? What happens with expansionary policy? I want you to kind of take a minute and come up with your answers. If you have any questions about what that does, please feel free to ask me. I'm not going to go through it on this lecture because I want you to do it. Remember, this is an extraordinary circumstance where you need to make sure that you're practicing and understanding this on your own terms. So if you are totally confused by this, after making an effort to figure it out, reach out to me. This is also a cheap excuse for you to actually say hi to me as well. Okay. Next part is the HL math.